Hello everyone. Recently, our good friend Kyle Kuliński voiced his opinion in regards to Jordan Peterson's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Now, I'm not a fan of Peterson. Personally, I find him to be the type of person who uses poetic and scientific language to make people overlook the ignorance and sheer stupidity in his statements. If you heard Peterson being referred to as a Christian Deepak Chopra, I concur. To me, Peterson's view on philosophy is equivalent to that of a lobster's whose brain melted one time too many. I like Kyle. I probably agree with him on multiple policies. I will try to edit out as little as possible so nobody can say I'm taking Kyle out of context. Peterson, on the other hand, tends to chop his ideas into little pieces and package separately, so I think clips provided by Kyle should be just enough. It's going to be a double reply. Kyle reacts to what Peterson said. It's only fair that I react to what both of them have to say. This way, we should avoid some misunderstandings about my position. With this short introduction, let's get into the clip. I have my vodka. I'm JP, and this is Liberal Opinion.
Jordan Peterson spoke to Joe Rogan, and he made a point about the 1% that I want to share with you. And I think this is the core to what I object to in Peterson's politics.
Because the right-wingers can say, hierarchy uber alles, right? That the state is correct and everything's right. And so
No, Jordan. That's authoritarians. Remember, in communism, it is believed that the state is always correct too. That is why you've seen centrally planned economies in all socialist countries ever. Even China today, where there are fewer regulations than in USA, ultimately is a centrally planned economy. In authoritarianism, it don't matter where you fall on the spectrum. You will always claim control over society for the state. You will apply it differently depending on whether you're on the right or on the left or in center.
So that's the right-wing totalitarian types. And the left can say, we'll flatten everything so there's no inequality. And so both the left...
I'm hoping you're not trying to make it a dichotomy. I don't want to strawman you and assume you're saying racism represents order and hierarchy, and not racism represents chaos and anarchy, because that's what it really sounds like to me.
And the left and the right can go too far. Now, the problem is we know how to define, I think one of the problems is we know how to define when the right goes too far. I think we learned that after World War II. I think if you're making claims of ethnic or racial superiority, you get to be put in a box and put off the shelf. Right.
Oh, what do you know? You really were making an argument that racism is a right-wing ideal. Wow. This makes the left sound so much better. Jordan, my man, did you forget that fascists were centrists? Does it mean that in your bizarre world, everyone to the right of the center is too far gone? What are we left with? Jordan. Again, being right-wing or left-wing, no matter how far you go, don't automatically make you an authoritarian tyrant.
Right. You're not in the dialogue anymore. It's obvious that the left can go too far, even though they're necessary participants in the discussion, but we don't know how to define when they've gone too far. And
it's because you're trying to collectivize people who have opposite worldviews into one category. Jordan, that's why you cannot define it. I can be more to the left than Chairman Mao and not think to myself, I should murder 60 million people for the crime of being educated. That's because the left-right spectrum don't work that way.
I don't have an obvious example.
No, and you might think, well, that's the moderate leftists' problem.
Don't jump out of your suit, Jordan. You didn't expect Joe to challenge you, did ya? Quickly, change the subject, and fast, before he notices how empty your position is. Obviously, Joe was going to give an example of Stalinist USSR. But okay, let Peterson change the topic. He loves the sound of his own voice so much.
Their moral responsibility to dissociate themselves from the radicals, just as it's the moral responsibility of reasonable conservatives to dissociate themselves from the John Birch and Ku Klux Klan types.
That's a very important.
I don't think they have the moral responsibility to dissociate themselves. Not greater than persons from the opposite side of the spectrum, at least. You don't see anyone say that the Tea Party people have the moral responsibility to dissociate themselves from Antifa. Understandably so, because they don't share the same ideology. And the same applies to the moderate leftists, as you call them. I suppose people who are center-left. The great majority does not belong in the same ideological group as the radicals. You are collectivizing them into left or right. And that's like saying Hindi people are black because their skin color. They don't fit into the category you're trying to put them in.
Point.
But it isn't just the moderate left's problem, because even the people on the right don't know what to point to when they say, no, you've gone too far as a leftist.
No, I'm pretty sure people on the right do exactly know what does it mean to be too far on the left for their liking. That is of course subjective and individual matter of judgment based on one's values and principles. Nonetheless, virtually anyone should have no problem to determine that.
Now I've tried to, it's complicated because I think it might be more than one policy. I think the really...
Yeah, it really isn't just one policy that people would disagree on. But people tend to focus on policies closest to their hearts, so for many, one is enough. That's why I said the line is subjective and different for each individual.
deadly leftist presumption is equality of outcome.
Make up your mind, Jordan. You should read 12 Rules for Life. I forgot the author.
I think as soon as you start talking about equality of outcome, you should be put in a box and put off the shelf. But it isn't obvious.
But it is obvious to those who can rub two brain cells together. That's about the first thing I'm agreeing on so far, maybe besides the part about rejecting racism. Equality of outcome is not something we should bother ourselves with.
It's why, like, that doesn't sound like, you know, white people overall. It doesn't have the same guttural punch that the excess of the right has. Well,
because that's not the excess of the right. Just like Marxist principles are not the excess of the left. They are but potential ideological positions.
look, even now, it's like, well, let's say we rally against the 1%, you know, and those would be the money owners, let's say. It's like, okay, who's in that group? Well, everybody in North America is in that group.
No, not everybody. Hardly anybody, actually. But I'm sure you're going to backpedal on this one as well. Please, Joe, don't disappoint me.
Worldwide, yeah.
Well, but who
But when
sets
you-
the parameters,
Right,
right?
well,
It's like,
it's $34,000 a year sets you in the 1% worldwide.
right. So
Right. So, 31,000 a year. Let's assume that's correct. Jordan assumes it. He agreed. So, let's go with it. I'm sure there's plenty of people in North America who live off of 12,000 a year or less. I'm not going to be statistical warrior here, but look up average income in Mexico, which is in North America, and tell me if it's above or below 31,000 a year. Mind you, 1 every 4 persons in North America lives in Mexico. And then there are poor people in USA, where the average income is only little over 31,000.
So does that make all of us oppressors?
Basically, everybody who lives above poverty in America is in the 1% of the world.
Right, right. And also by historical standards.
Yeah.
We don't live in the past, Jordan. Anyway, let's see what Kyle have to say about the whole exchange. Kyle's a smart boy. Must be from his Polish grandmother's side. He will save the day.
Okay, so first let's address the equality of outcome point. He's saying that, well, on the right, there are people who go too far, and you could say those people are the white supremacists. KKK people, John Bircher people. In a different part of the podcast, he says, like, neo-Nazis. So, you know, to his credit, you know, sometimes people smear him as like, oh, he's alt-right. No, he's not alt-right. He's kind of clearly said, he says, I'm against identity politics, and I'm also against it when the right-wingers play it, and right-wingers playing identity politics is white supremacy.
So first thing out of the way. Kyle buys into right means white, and Nazi are far right. Sure, they were on the right, but not all that far. And I get it. Kyle is working from American perspective, where non-white identitarian movements were not extremely popular. I can maybe from the top of my head list one or two right-leaning groups that focus on identity of minority groups, like Black Panther Party, or currently the African People's Socialist Party, you know, the one Ghazi the Black Hitler is part of. Kyle gives Peterson too much credit for defining identity politics. Peterson is not a Marxist and he's not alt-right, that's true, but he does use identity politics when he sees it fit. The whole spiel you're reacting to is him collectivizing people into two camps, Kyle.
So, he says that's the excesses of the right. Now, for the left, he says it's not clear when the left goes too far, but, you know, one of the other things he points to is identity politics. I tend to agree with him, broadly speaking, that identity politics is a problem on the left. I think when we get down into the particulars, him and I do have some disagreements about identity politics. But broadly, overall, on the point, fine. Identity politics is a problem. I agree with him on that.
I wish you actually shown a part where he's talking about identity politics. Yeah, identity politics is dog shit. I hope more people agree on that statement.
But he says, well, the real hallmark of when the left goes too far is when they promote equality of outcome. So not equal opportunity, equality of outcome. Now, again, this is an area where I think I agree with him that that's a problem. I don't support equality of outcome. I support equal opportunity. But here's the thing. I think there's so few people who actually support equality of outcome where it's almost negligible and barely needs to be mentioned. So, yeah, there are some people who might support equality of outcome, but what fucking percentage are we talking about here? I would submit to you.
Honestly, everyone ever calling themselves a socialist. There's quite a few of them. Kyle, it's okay to say they exist. Hell, you're actively promoting some of them to be elected to positions of power. Do some people mislabel themselves? Sure, maybe. Bernie Sanders seems to not understand the difference between social democrat and democratic socialist. A prominent politician mislabeling themselves only validates the real socialist positions. You know, like with religion. Don't say the Bible is good moral book if you don't agree that women should be punished for being raped.
That there are way more people on the far right who support one version or another of white supremacist politics.
Really? You're really saying that with a straight face? Tell me again, how many leftists participate in events like Women's March, compared to how many participants Klan rallies and alt-right meetings have?
A bigoted approach to politics. There are way more of them on the right than there are people on the left who support equality of outcome. You know, as somebody who is honestly one of the most prominent left-wing talkers, commentators in the country, especially when it comes to the internet, I've never experienced a lefty coming up to me and saying like, oh yeah, I can't wait till we implement.
That's because those people don't see you as part of their cause, Kyle. You're an useful idiot to them at best. Kyle, have you heard a phrase, liberals get the bullet too? For them, you're no better than alt-right. No matter how far to the left you are, they will call you far-right if you just dare to voice a disagreement.
What does that mean? We go into a fucking corporation and say, we will now force that the janitor is paid the exact same amount as the CEO.
That's exactly what they want to do. Except probably there would no longer be CEOs, because communism and whatnot.
No, in the circles I run in and when I talk to people, what we try to do is make it a meritocracy, but in order to have a meritocracy, everybody needs to start the race at the same time from the same point. So what that means is there are some non-negotiables, there are some things that are off the table in what's supposed to be a modern, developed, civilized society. One of those things is healthcare. Another one of those things is education, including college. You know, and a living wage is another one, that if you work full time, you should make enough money to survive. So, in other words, my experience with people on the left is that overwhelmingly people on the left are just trying to create a system that is fair, that gives people an equal shot at success.
And that's fine. It's the kind of thing I would find myself in agreement with you, Kyle. But that does not invalidate the fact that the vocal minority ultimately controls the indifferent majority.
And then let's say after being given an equal playing field or relatively equal playing field, one person doesn't go as far as another person. Nobody's saying they should be paid like the exact same amount from cradle to grave and make equal outcomes a fact of reality. Or at the very least, very few people are saying that. So to present it as if it's like this scourge of, you know, untamable, uncontrolled lefties who are all out there advocating for equality of outcome, I don't know where he gets that from. I really don't.
I believe you when you say you don't see it. Because you're not looking properly. And that's fine. There are people willing to correct you. I'm sure you're willing to change your mind if shown evidence.
I don't think it's even close to being a problem because I've never even heard it. And again, I'm one of the people who's in these left-wing circles. You know, you talk to people on the left, they're mostly talking about, yeah, let's do Medicare for all. Let's end the wars. Let's do free college. Let's do a living wage. Now, are there some people? Yeah, sure. We covered a story the other day. Some people in DSA, they like the idea of like, let's abolish profit. Okay, I don't agree with that. Let's abolish borders. I don't agree with that. Some say let's abolish prisons. No, I abolish private prisons, not all prisons. So yes, there are examples of people on the left going too far, and I will continue to call them out when they do go too far, and I'll continue to call them out when they use identity politics to obfuscate and deflect from real specific policy issues. But this idea that there's a scourge of lefties that are fighting for equality of outcome, I don't see it. I don't see it.
Are you looking but you're not seeing? Or... Okay. Kyle, just because you don't agree with the crazies, which I'm happy to know you don't mean the crazies are not out there. Yeah, they don't outnumber sane people by any stretch of imagination. But to say that this kind of people gaining influence through activism is not a problem, that's just short-sightedness, man. What do you think the wage gap between different demographic groups being brought up is but an attempt to push equal outcome policies?
Okay, now, let's get to the point I really wanted to focus on, which is the 1% point. So his argument is, and I hear this all the time in libertarian circles, and I've seen it on conservative outlets where they'll write articles about how, oh, the left is going after the 1%, but did you know that, so many Americans, if you're over the poverty line in the U.S., you're in the global 1%. So what do you want to do? Do you want to go after those people? Do you want to crack down on the people making $35,000 a year, you stupid lefties? And here's my counterpoint to that. Literally, nobody has argued for that. Literally, nobody has argued.
Literally, you're full of shit. You just said that Socialist Party of America wants to abolish profit and borders. You turn around and say nobody wants to attack wealthy people on a global scale. Peterson, contradicting himself, don't give you a pass on doing the same.
Argued for that. So again, this is kind of like propping up a really easy straw man so that you can slap it down. When people talk about...
Is it a straw man if it's true though?
The 1%. Now, first of all, there are nation states around the world. We live in a nation state. So...
Yeah, not for very long if socialist gets their way. You know, the people you claim don't exist.
You have nation states, you have borders, and you have... one of the most important aspects of that is organization. So yes, you're governed by certain rules and laws, and there's a way the system works when you're on this patch of dirt versus on that patch of dirt over the Atlantic Ocean or whatever. So when we talk about the 1%...
Ever heard of European Union? It's a bunch of independent nation states which through political will of governments became a subject to higher governing body, and the borders have been nearly erased. That's how the process of globalization looks like. Are you saying that if EU governing bodies decide to crack down on 1%ers, it would matter whether you're in Germany or in Czech Republic? Where are your borders now?
Obviously, what we mean is the 1% that we have the ability to govern over because they're part of this country. So it's just like a weird dodge. It's like a weird obfuscating point to bring up, but what about the global 1%? We don't have a fucking one world government, so there's nothing I could do about some dude who's in the 1% and fucking, whatever, you name the country, in Ukraine. I have nothing to do with that.
But it's not about you, Kyle. You've just accepted Peterson collectivizing you with a bunch of ideological blocks into the left, like you don't care, and now you have problem when his criticism, however stupid they might sound, don't 100% match your positions as an individual. Then don't let him collectivize you to begin with. He's talking about forces that are actively working towards us having a one-world government, no borders, and no capitalism. Look, personally, I am not 100% against such idea. However, functioning communism can be achieved only through capitalism and technology. I'm opposed to socialists and revolutions.
So we don't have a one world government. We live in the United States of America. So when lefties in the U.S. talk about the 1%, they're talking about the 1% that we have legislative power over in a democracy, which is in our own country. So Americans who are in the 1%. Now,
socialists, communists, don't necessarily see the difference between US and the world. That's the point. Let's just give it to you.
Now, it goes deeper than that too, though. In my experience, when I talk to people on the left, and this is something I've talked about for a long time, the people who bought our government are the problem. Now, it's a fact that that's happening. Corporations give campaign contributions to politicians. Politicians get elected, and they do the bidding of those corporations. That's just the nature of reality in the United States of America. There is no counter-argument to that. You know, we've covered studies on the show that have concluded America is effectively an oligarchy. It's not a democracy. Because if you're in the bottom 95%, 99%, perhaps even, of the American people, what you want your government to do doesn't happen. They reflect the will of the 1%.
Kyle, you know this. To be 1% in USA, you don't need to earn $1 million annually. 380,000 is enough. It's still more than most of people can dream of. That is why it's called 1%, not 50%. But it's not impossible to achieve through hard work. The trick is you need to put the effort in your education really early. People just don't do that. Well, some do. That's why the median income for Asian Americans is almost double of the median income of the average American. Does it mean that you should demonize Asian Americans for controlling the government? Of fucking course not. Jesus.
They reflect the will of the ownership class. They reflect the will of corporations and billionaires. So when people rant against the 1%, inherent in what they're saying is the people who have bought our government, the people who have rigged the system against regular people and for themselves.
Yeah, but that's not the 1% doing this. That's the point. It's the mega rich individuals and corporations. Somebody making 380,000, hell, 500,000, 900,000 a year. They don't have the money to rig the system.
Themselves. So, I mean, look, these are all things that I don't think this is that difficult, and I think Jordan Peterson knows this, and if I were to point this out to him, he'd be like, okay, yeah, you're right. So I don't know why you bother to make that point of like, the global 1% includes people making over $30,000 in the U.S. Yeah, and none of us are talking about, you know what? Are we really talking about taxing somebody who makes $40,000 a year, the same amount as somebody who makes, like Jeff Bezos, who has over $100 billion? Nobody's saying that. Nobody ever advocated for that. Thing number one is get the corrupting influences out of our system.
Peterson, goofy and inaccurate as he is, he's taking perspective of the people he's talking about.
And before you say, oh, that's pie in the sky, that's not possible, that's crazy, lefty unicorn fairy dust.
Kyle, nobody said that. Don't reply to things that were said. At least not by the Peterson. I think you were supposed to reply to what he have to say.
No, there is an answer. It's called clean elections. You get the private money out of the system and you do publicly financed elections so that when you have elections, you have a real competing battle of different ideas and philosophies that the American people can pick from. And they can say, I like that guy's policies over that woman's policies or whatever. So when we talk about the 1%, we're talking about, hey, corporations should stop buying our government and owning it like a fucking oligarchy or kleptocracy or plutocracy. And we should have more of a democracy where they represent the people, and because that's the way it's supposed to fucking work. A constitutional republic and a representative democracy. Right now it functions as an oligarchy or a kleptocracy or a plutocracy, and that's the problem. So when we talk about the 1%, we're talking about getting that corporate money out of the system. We're talking about getting that billionaire money out of the system. And we're talking about giving the American people an option as to what they want the rules to be.
And Peterson would probably agree with you on the clean elections. However, if I understand the lizard brain of his correctly, he is attacking the very same problem of distorting democratic process as he sees coming from the socialist left. The very vocal minority is attempting and succeeding in controlling, at least to an extent, the policy decisions through means that should be off the table. And if I'm right on this one, I would have to agree with both of you to an extent. In my opinion, money corrupts the system just as much as threat of political violence. You won't care what silent majority wants when a vocal minority punches you in the face. And if you don't think that's true, just remember, Hitler didn't win an election, nor did Stalin or Mao. They all were appointed or took power by force.
So listen, people, this idea that like, oh, if you leave the people on their own, they're like a fucking uncontrollable mob. Not really. Because when you look at the opinion polls, people are pretty reasonable. You know, if you come up with this idea of, let's try to tax everybody who makes over $100,000 90%, go ahead, put that up to a vote, see how that works out for you. It's not going to happen. People are relatively reasonable. Where they'll go, okay, sure, maybe we tax you 50% over, $5 million. Maybe we'll do that because that's not unreasonable, because in that system you still have people who are tremendously wealthy and have more money than they'll ever know what to do with, but you also can ameliorate economic inequality to the point where you won't have people working full time and not making enough money to survive. You won't have people going bankrupt because they don't have access to healthcare. So that's when people talk about the 1%, that's what they talk about. I mean, listen to some of these facts. The richest 1% make over 20% of the income in this country. The last time it was that high, the Great Depression. So that's not sustainable. In the long run, to lessen income inequality, not making everything perfectly even, very few people, if anybody's arguing for that, but to lessen income inequality actually stabilizes the system in the long run for everybody involved. So it's actually better for even the mega rich if you have a system where the 1% is not gobbling up 20% of the income. In the US, the top 1% of households owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. One family, the Walton family, has more wealth than nearly half the country combined. I think it's 45%. One family, 6 people, more wealth than 45% of the country. In 1965, CEOs made 24 times what the average worker made. Today, it's over 300 times. Half of workers in America make $30,000 a year or less. Wages in the U.S. have been stagnant since the 1980s. 76% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So here's the point. We don't live in a meritocracy. So Jordan Peterson, from what I can gather from his comments on politics, he actually likes this idea of a meritocracy. Guess what, buddy? I do too. I do too. But in order to have a meritocracy, think of it as a 100-yard dash. You need to have everybody starting at the 0-yard line at the same time. And against Jordan Peterson here is, we don't live in a meritocracy. So this idea of like, well, the hierarchy developed and it reflects relatively well people's intelligence and their hard work. That's not true. Why the fuck is Paris Hilton mega rich then?
I suppose it's because of your poor editing, but you're addressing things that were not said in the clips you showed, so I don't know what to say about it.
People I've known in my life, I know people who work 3 jobs, hardest workers I've ever seen in my life, still living below the poverty line. So all we're talking about is, hey, maybe if you work a full-time job, you should make enough money to survive.
Now, I don't live in USA. Surprise. Nor I live in a wealthy country like Sweden or Denmark. Nonetheless, it's very difficult for me to believe in this working 3 jobs and cannot survive spiel. I could go off on a tangent about how nobody should be responsible for your own decisions and actions but yourself, and you should just go to a library and study 2 nights a week and get better jobs, just like my partner did. But then a part of me is for universal income, where everyone should get a bare minimum and then work if they want to have anything nice and tasty.
Maybe you should give people equal opportunity, which means giving them healthcare like every other developed country, giving them a college education like most other developed countries. Even Slovenia can do free college. We can't do free college?
True. US is a third world country at this point. What's wrong with Slovenia then? They are not rich, but they are doing pretty good. I don't understand why you're shitting on them every time you're making a point about education. Slovenia have higher GDP per capita than Poland, far bigger and more wealthy country, which also have universal healthcare and free higher education.
So I'm talking about equality of opportunity so that you can then say, okay, now it's a meritocracy. We've given you a fair shot. You have the bare minimums. Now it's on you. Now you go ahead.
And Peterson is not talking about you. Obviously, you're not a socialist.
And guess what? When we live in a country where the top 1% of households owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined, they didn't just work harder, Jordan. They didn't just work harder. To get these extreme numbers, it's not just that the rich are just that much more intelligent or that much more hardworking or put in that much more time. That's honestly a preposterous notion.
At some point, money makes money on its own. Give it several generations continue family business and you get mega rich people. Leave mega rich aside. You think Tom Cruise or Beyonce works so much harder than your free jobs friend? Is it really so unfair that NFL superstar makes more than a teacher? Perhaps you would agree with me that they earned it. But the left Peterson is talking about, the socialists, they don't agree.
And again, so now broaden it out to the world. Yeah, when the richest 6 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. So 6 people more than like 3.5 billion combined. They didn't just work harder. The system is not a reflection of anything. It's elites rigging the rules in their favor to maintain dominance and control and an unfair hierarchy. So that's what I believe in. I believe in equal opportunity.
Hey Kyle, I think it's great. I believe in equal opportunity as well. And Jordan Peterson also. Probably. He's so stupid, he probably don't know if he does. I can only hope you see this response. And maybe give yourself a few minutes to think about the things Peterson is really talking about and not about yourself. You're not who he's talking about.